So Steve's gonna be joining us remotely today, so I'm recording for him. So if you all don't mind, I'm gonna be recording you too.
Oh no.
Hi, Steve.
Hello, Steve.
Hi. The rain. Like, makes things more complicated, but it makes the earth green. So praise the Lord. Okay, heavy readings for today. I thought that in keeping with the spirit of our intertextuality for this module, we would do our meditation today by looking back at Poetry of Witness again. I'd like to draw your attention once again to the 2 volumes edited by Carolyn Forche, who we started with at the beginning of this class, this course, where we read her Reading the Living Archives, and she talked about the fragmentation of words and the way in which language encodes pain. And she is one of the first scholars that ever developed the literary genre or the literary category of Poetry of Witness. And so she, in one volume called Against Forgetting, and then in a second volume with, I think it's Edward Wu, last name W-U, they edited 2 volumes looking at 2 different historical time periods of Poetry of Witness, massive volumes. So they do the Reading Living Archives is one of the introductions to one of the 2 of those volumes. And the volume, it's interesting because she provides therein a criteria for what she considers Poetry of Witness. And one of the things that she considers Poetry of Witness is poetry by victims of AIDS. And so it's interesting that Walter Holland, who we're going to read this morning, is one of these people that also self-consciously categorizes his own and his friends' own projects as Poetry of Witness. So 2 things we'll do. I'd like for us to just read through a little bit of background on who Walter Holland is, a little bit of his autoethnography, if you will. And then we'll have, so if somebody would do that for us, and then if somebody else would read for us this very short poem by him at the very, very end called The Journal of the Plague Years. So that will be a second reader. And then if a third reader would antiphonally put into chorus with the cry or the Poetry of Witness of Holland, the 30th chapter of Job, which is the Lament of Job that we're going to look at today. I thought that would help us potentially see what Nadar is talking about, which both Nadar and West are talking about, which is that potentially the lament language, the cursing language, the honest vocabulary that's being developed, even though it's tensive, even though it's uncertain, it's being developed in Job, could potentially be a spiritual resource for the empowerment and healing of marginalized communities, particularly communities that are struggling with living with the reality of AIDS. So, would someone read Holland's little autobiography? Would you? And then would someone else read A Journal of the Plague Years? Okay, would you? And then would one more person read Job 30? Okay, great. Let's dive in.
A Poetry of Crisis, A Poetry of Witness by Walter Holland, Ph.D. In 1987, I was 34 years old. My first poem was published in Christopher Street magazine, and I felt excited and optimistic about the small community of writers, poets mostly, with whom I had come into contact in New York City. Many of these writers were part of the gay community and participated in its lively, flourishing downtown culture. The most influential for me was Asato Saint, a Haitian-American poet and performance artist, who was to play a pivotal role in my development. But there were other local and national writers on the scene as well. David Craig, Austin, Alan Barnett, Walter Borowski, Melvin Dixon, David Frechette, Axis Hempel, and Paul Monette. What I could not have foreseen then was how every single one of these writers would be dead inside of 10 years. They died along with others of their generation, including 8 of my closest personal friends. They were gone before I reached the age of 45. continue?
Please.
AIDS was not new to the scene in 1987. Everyone had been touched by it. At that time, there was no effective treatment, no cocktail to slow the disease. Panic was still rampant, and most of my friends were HIV positive and living with the virus. What was key to me was that my seropositive friends were living openly and defiantly, and for the most part were still survivors and not victims. We began to write about AIDS as though we were living in a time of war and forced occupation. The political climate was charged. Those infected were plunged into an adversarial struggle, a struggle to gain basic services and to manage their medical treatments and their finances. Conversations were about drugs, doctor's appointments, hospitalizations, and the dramatic stories of tragic endings, defiant deaths. A poetry of crisis and witness was born overnight. Our writing became focused on the political and upon preserving our personal histories. Writing became elegiac, a refuge for enormous chaotic outpourings of universal grief. Writing sometimes in a Kafkaesque style, we tried to express the irony and insanity of those early years filled with bureaucracy and the total loss of separation between church and state. In an age of biased AIDS journalism and increasing medical disinformation, there was a tremendous need to put a human face on the disease and to deal overnight with the disruptive way it affected daily existence. There was a call to counter the negative press, which sought to victimize and demonize the gay men and minorities who first contracted the disease. There was also a need to make visible something that was lacerating the gay community, to raise a cry of alarm to the rest of the world that here was a truly insidious and tragic disease striking men and women in their prime. At the epicenter in New York, terrible things were happening. As a healthcare worker by day, I saw the toll the disease was taking on the medical system. Many writers, journalists, professionals, and activists began to focus on the crisis, bring their intelligence and insight to bear upon the medical establishment and the media at large. Many fine gay activist organizations took their start during the early AIDS years. The Gay Men's Health Crisis and the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, for example. It is perhaps the untold story of this plague how both healthcare and the media were transformed by the bold, challenging, and provocative questions and demands of that early generation of HIV-infected men and women.
Unless you want to switch off with somebody, how you doing?
I'm fine.
Okay.
As a poet, I felt in the immediacy of verse a means to respond swiftly to the AIDS debacle. I was joined in this opinion by Soto. Spending time to nurse his own life partner, Soto often said that he had little time to write prose. Poetry was a means to record on paper a swift testament to the ones he loved so well and defiantly. To set the record straight on issues of political oppression and AIDS hypocrisy. As a young man, I found my life more and more diverted by the call to join forces with this movement. This movement to respond, to advocate, to bear witness, and to speak out on issues, not only regarding AIDS, but regarding being gay. Poetry, more than any other medium, seemed ideally suited towards conveying the sense of boundless emotion and praise I felt toward my friends. I read the World War I poet Winfred Owen and began to understand his sense of pathos and mortality. I too was witnessing an entire generation of Americans' best and brightest being annihilated. Poetry can safeguard the spirit in times of war and plague and societal strife. It has led the power to transcend and create a communal voice, a sense of universal understanding. Like choral voices of old, poetry in those years sang of the staggering defeats of the gay, lesbian, and minority communities. This defeat nevertheless brought with it a certain honor and place in history. There were universal outpourings of defiance, incredible acts of valor and compassion. AIDS poetry became an invocation to the reader to join in a communal sense of grief mixed with outrage at the incredible intolerance that surrounded the disease. AIDS verse focused on the strange ironies of linking love, sex, religion, and death. The body and desire became important subjects for AIDS poetry. As scientists turned their microscopes with ever greater focus upon the AIDS virus and the human subject, so poets were forced to magnify and dissect with greater clarity the elements of modern love, sexuality, science, and death. AIDS poetry needed to redress the enormous perceived distances between the general public and the AIDS infected, between doctor and patient, between straight and gay, by examining the language of political and medical expediency and finding common bonds of the human in all of us. The inanimate worlds of high-tech medicine and drug nomenclature became part of the imagistic landscape of AIDS figurative language. Religious metaphors and allegory were superimposed in ever more alienated life views and experiences in order to show the ironies inherent in the catechism of hatred that had swept many organized religious institutions. Also, the natural world and the ascetic world underwent an extreme and isolating scrutiny. Mark Doty, Richard McCann, and Carl Phillips, among others, showed us how the familiar poetic terrain of romanticized nature and an ornate cultural past held a certain glow of sadness. By focusing on these worlds, Doty brought out just how far older poetic concepts of emotion recollected in tranquility, transcendence as sublimity, and the visionary experience had been diminished in the post-industrial age. Other writers, such as Paul Monet, would rave an outspoken concern at the blinders on American popular culture, which lacked the decorum of an ancient past or a learned Western tradition to dignify and mortalize modern death. The medical and journalistic language surrounding AIDS collided with conventional poetic speech. AIDS verse was called upon to subvert and appropriate, diffuse and disarm the harsh and impersonal vocabulary of science, and find a way to talk about things in society long denied and repressed. Not only AIDS, but breast cancer as well as many other once taboo subjects became subject matter for exploration in American poetry. The powerful linkage of sex with death as a theme pervaded the culture. It had to be explored especially because it touched upon the deep guilt and self-hatred long at work with internalized homophobia. The dissolution of youth needed to be addressed as well in a culture intoxicatingly focused upon preserving youth at all costs and promoting an idealized view of the body. AIDS forced science and society to divorce the physical act of sex from the context of religious morality. Sex had to be looked at in new clinical ways that confronted age-old secrecy and sublimation. This move undid in a few short years many lifetimes of deeply seated moral views. The disease, with its harsh and violent attacks upon the body, called attention to the physical in a new and shocking way that proved disturbing. It gave the poet the role of demystifying more and more intimate areas of what was once deemed the private, and to seek ever more knowledge about the forbidden. The sanctity of medical and religious language is questioned for its use to suppress access to life-saving AIDS treatments. Love poetry and erotic poetry were revitalized in the time of AIDS as poets turned their focus poets turned their focus towards their desire in the face of powerful myths and assumptions.
The last section basically just locates the task of the AIDS poet in this tradition of crisis and witness. So you can look more at that, those like final four paragraphs if this topic interests you, to see the ways, particularly in which this became institutionalized with National Poetry Month. There's like an AIDS Awareness Day where poetry is often read, and it talks about the precision of language and the function of society. In other words, what I'm saying is it's talking about the way in which poetic language erupts from inside the experience of the gay man or the gay woman or the minority, the African, and erupts into history, creating space for new possibilities, that poetry itself does that. And so this, as poetry does that, breaks these things apart by erupting into them, it creates new possibilities for new types of political organization, new holidays, new recognitions, new categories of memory, and new possibilities for healing from trauma. So again, I'd like to draw your attention back to Forchet and Wu, and they have two huge volumes on this type of poetry. So even if the AIDS crisis itself isn't your particular area or text of interest, there's war poetry in there, there's poetry from minority experiences, and basically what it's doing is it's talking exactly about this, the function of poetry for creating language, which is exactly what our two authors for today talked about. Both West and Nadar talked about the necessity for articulating suffering for sufferers of AIDS or victims of AIDS or families of people with AIDS, and the way that silence actually allows the ongoing theology that AIDS is a punishment for something from God to continue. That only by articulating that suffering and beginning to write against that, by immortalizing death, by romanticizing death again, by dignifying people that are dying as victims of this, by resisting science in the way and reconfiguring science to make new categories for sexuality, by doing those things and articulating that, both Nadar and West, and then here also Holland and the entire generation of the first poets of witness about HIV are saying, we need to rethink about what we're talking about when we're talking about love, when we talk about passion, when we're talking about death. So to get a feeling for kind of what this language of this type of poetry sounds like, I'd like to draw our attention to the poem by Holland called A Journal of the Plague of Years.
I remember dancing in July on the banks of the Hudson in the city, the way some of us, innocent then, reported the rumors we had heard. I remember you, a doctor, discussing your work on the wards of San Francisco and the way we worried about our friends and the way you stood in the elevator pushing an IV stand, not really speaking. The calls at night and the endless plans to move from the city and the fevers you had and the pills by your bed and the vigil I kept until you died. I remember the party for your birthday, the way you wore a floral print shirt, an amused smile on your thin face, the flash of my camera filling the room, sudden, startling even now. Then Scott fell ill soon after, and Raymond was said to have disappeared. No word of funeral or forwarding address, just unanswered calls to his mother, the never knowing if he had died, and the way I watched Robert stare at the panel they'd made for Kyle, the way we stood astonished in a room spread full of names, the fabric of the quilt unfurled, silk-like, brilliant.
So with that in the back of our minds, I'd like to invite Justine to read for us the Lament from Job 30.
But now they make sport of me, those who are younger than I, whose fathers would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. What could I gain from the strength of their hands? All their vigor is gone. Through want and hard hunger, they gnaw the dry and desolate ground. They pick mallow and the leaves of bushes, and to warm themselves, the roots of broom. They are driven out from society. People shout after them as after a thief. In the gullies of wadis they must live, in holes in the ground and in the rocks. Among the bushes they bray, under the nettles they huddle together. A senseless, disreputable brood, they have been whipped out of the land. And now they mock me in song. I am a byword to them. They abhor me. They keep aloof from me. They do not hesitate to spit at the sight of me, because God has loosened my bowstring and humbled me. They have cast off restraint in my presence. On my right hand, the rabble rises up. They send me sprawling and build roads for my ruin. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. No one restrains me. As through a wide reach they come, amid the crash they roll on. Terrors are turned upon me. My honor is pursued as by the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. With violence he seizes my garment. He grasps me by the collar of my tunic. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry to you, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you merely look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. I know that you will bring me to death, and to the house appointed for all living. Surely one does not turn against the needy, when in disaster they cry for help. Did I not weep for those whose day was hard? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came. And when I waited for light, darkness came. My inward parts are in turmoil and are never still. Days of affliction come to meet me. I go about in sunless gloom. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with me. My lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep.
God, hear our prayers. Oof. Reactions, thoughts, things that stuck out to you, and or pieces from the reading for this week that may connect with or have been brought up for you while reading these different pieces?
So I'm interested in this idea of appropriation. It's brought up in the West piece, which has been germane to conversations we've been having in our racist context class with students, where those of us outside the location of those suffering have been warned to not appropriate experiences of those who are suffering or experiencing.
Right.
And I have a friend who's challenging me to say, no, appropriate it, use it. That's resistance. That's what you're being given this for.
Wow.
And so I think about this fourth moment returns to an appropriation, but an appropriation of a different historically distanced text as it applied to Job, but then connecting that with these horrible experiences of men who could not there was nowhere to even have their funeral. The coroners wouldn't even touch the bodies. Their parents wouldn't even take them. And the poetry that was used to express that obviously brought healing and empowered them. And yet we have to tell those stories, that even those of us who are not, that's not our experience. So I'm still not comfortable with appropriation because I'm been made to be a little very gun-shy.
Cautious. Yeah.
Cautious. That's a better
Yeah,
word,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
And yet, this friend is challenging me about that in a completely different way.
And it's this interesting bedfellow, right? This fourth step of appropriation for us, because the larger context of our lecture discussion for today will be how not to speak in the midst of suffering, and how we can't speak for the other, question mark, like is that where we come out, that when we speak for the other, that actually objectifies the other and makes the other unable to speak for himself or herself. So with what caution and discernment do we carefully tread in the place where we appropriate this when it's not our experience, when we risk potentially silencing someone else? Like, how do we walk this fine line of what I call advocacy, but we're talking about when we're talking about standing in solidarity, speaking for others, using other stories to remember, to cause the memory to come alive again. I mean, that for me was what was so beautiful about Holland's poem was, I recall the text that Forshé started her article with on Reading the Living Archives. Remember when she was talking about the Russian author who's standing in the line for bread, for rations, and the woman in front of her recognizes her and turns to her and says, "Will you be able to write this down?" And she says, "I will." And she says, a look of relief came across the woman's face and said, "Well, then they'll remember us." As if just recording the history of it and having someone read it aloud lets the ghost live again, right? That this is the idea of witness that we've been kind of constructing in this class. Is witness is not just about verbal proclamation. It's not just about preaching the gospel. That witness itself is about something living in us. That when we witness to Christ's self lives in us, and that people can encounter God in us. And that when we witness to the history of indigenous peoples, the spirit and history of those people comes alive again, and people can encounter them and be transformed, convicted, changed by an encounter with those indigenous folks that we, white conquerors, have killed, right? That witness is about actually making things come alive again. The spirit of something is awakened again in what we do when we witness. And yet, it's this question about when we speak and when we don't speak, and how we ought to speak, that becomes, according to what I'm proposing and what our authors are proposing, that becomes the theological import of Job. It's not about theodicity. It's not about explaining how God is sovereign and or powerful, and how innocent people suffer in light of that. That is not the question that's answered in Job. Burrell has argued that. Gutierrez has argued that. Nadar argues that. Our authors are saying in almost monovocal chorus, that is not what this book is about. And when folks come to this text looking for that, they walk away with dangerous theology.
Actually, believe it or not, this has actually been incredibly helpful because, this really is because, like when I was just trying to spit out, it's hard even to talk about this at times, but seriously, I also think that when you talk this witness, I feel like I'm witnessing for the people who aren't here now. And
Exactly.
He's exactly what he's saying in this
Yes.
work is that,
Yes.
that
And he's
the
naming
people
them.
that were ignored and, whether people were there for them or not, I mean, there was all level of, and even people whose parents didn't turn their backs on them, they changed the obituary. One of my friends' mom, lived in Atlanta, and literally this was her second child to die. And she put cancer instead of AIDS because she was afraid of what people might do to her.
Right.
It was that bad.
Which relates directly to this system of honor and shame that we're talking about in Job. It's not that far-fetched.
No, it
really isn't.
This really has been actually helpful. I'm probably starting to break. Not necessarily I'm going to see this as the resource and to be in the way, but you look at this in different contexts, and to me, the African crisis was different in a sense because in the United States, we're also dealing with the politics of the LGBT community was thrown into it, which people at that time were really just trying to ignore as best as possible. And, things have changed a great deal, but at the same time, also giving voice to people whose stories haven't been told, and whether they were well known or not.
Yes.
Yeah. And
what's not outrightly spoken by putting Holland's piece in conversation with Nadar is directly the actual relationship, political relationship between the AIDS crisis and the AIDS crisis in the U.S., where the political terrain of the AIDS crisis in the U.S. was about LGBTQ body politics and politics of sex. It actually was the same in Africa. What was different was the fact that it was women that were suffering most.
Yeah.
And this was a direct correlation with, economic inequality. So for instance, when we're looking at Swaziland, okay, let's just use one context, for instance. The economics of Swaziland had become so extreme that there were not jobs. Mining had kind of gone to shit. It's still a monarchy. There's not a lot of growth as far as GDP goes. The Human Development Index is extremely low. So infant mortality rates are high. I mean, it's compounded by economic crisis, right? So what was the solution? Well, men were leaving Swaziland and moving, because Swaziland is completely surrounded by the state of South Africa, right? Swaziland is like a little island in the middle of South Africa. And they were going to South Africa to find jobs because the economy in South Africa was booming. So what they were doing was they were living there sometimes for years at times, taking up with another woman, and then going home and sleeping with their wives. And that's how HIV was being passed so quickly to so many people, so at such an unbelievable rate. Because once infected, a man would go home and sleep with his wife, and then when he would go to the place where he had to go, it's the same topic of migration from the beginning of this, unit on Job. They would migrate to where the jobs were, and then infect all of their partners there. So it was about sex politics as well. What's unfortunate is it was about black bodies, and it was particularly about black female bodies. And so the conservative constituency in the US said, no, let's not do HIV training. These people need to get their morality under control. It's not about passing out condoms, it's about teaching them to be monogamous. And so the conservative, it's the same morality, religious morality that dictated the outlier experience of the AIDS person in his or her sexuality that made them further marginalized. Disabled people, It detracted from the acquisition of funds for research. It mitigated proven, effective recourse for education about AIDS, the spread of HIV and AIDS. I mean, literally, we had this coming from somebody that worked with conservative Christian NGOs for 10, 12 years of my life before I came to the academy. I mean, literally, World Vision, conservative organizations like that were wanting to do sex ed and hand out condoms. Like this was part of the proven educational in Uganda. It went down by over 80% with this type of education. Just got defunded because it was about morality. It was about teaching people to have better sexual ethics.
So the NGOs wanted to.
NGOs wanted to, but they couldn't get funding
From
other Christian
yeah,
constituents.
it was interesting, even Reagan's commission, the most conservative people in there, and once you put them in there, they came away with a very different view of all this.
Exactly.
But again, just the way, the press and just how it kept getting spun, and it was just like, it wasn't like, like I said, I think in the U.S., many people just tried to ignore
Oh,
it
of course.
because they figured it would never affect them. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was even younger than this guy, so it's like, it was,
Yeah.
looking back on it. But yeah, it's, it's it's just like, how many people around you died? And I mean, I just,
Can
you
you
know,
imagine? That's the thing.
I can't put that into words,
Yeah.
what my own experience was like. And there were support groups where somewhere they didn't even want to have anyone in the group who was not HIV positive because they couldn't understand what it was like, even though those of us were present or family or whatever.
Right.
And, you know,
Right. But that goes back to what West was saying about creating those spaces that are safe and sacred
Yeah.
for this very, very powerful formative process of being able to articulate suffering for the first time. And what's fascinating, and this reminded me of your comment about appropriation, was that happened first in West's article where he talks about the dude that kind of was like, I relate to Job and I want to take my own life, and like it kind of came out accidentally, and then he felt kind of like shamed about it, and then all of a sudden that freed all these other people to say that. It gave them space to be able to say it. And it was only after that, these are West's words, that vocabulary was built and that safe space was established, that they could then do the same process with families. Right? He says that they ended up taking it back and doing the same reading with the families who had people suffering from it. So it happened first, like you're saying, just with people where it was like, okay, we all understand where we're coming from. We can really say what we're thinking. And as far as trauma theory goes, that's quite interesting. It's quite interesting that it needed to be that progression.
I mean, even like, you know, even just like 2 years later than this, I was out campaigning for like the very first domestic partners measure in San Francisco, and it was then the earthquake happened. But it's like, you know, you go out and you would dress. I would dress. I dressed pretty conservatively anyway, but even more so to look presentable, because the press would always show the one person that didn't look like everybody else, and you got so tired of it.
Yeah.
And I remember being in that room. Coles was there. He's now with AFCLU, and he was. But I mean, I only stood out because I was probably the youngest person in the room, and I simply said, you know, this is just going to be the beginning. But we're going to see this through. If it's another 20, 30 years, things are going to change. They will. But that was just a hope.
Yeah.
Just a hope at the time that things could actually get better, because a lot of people, you know, couldn't see it.
Right.
You know?
And that is the thing that we've talked about a little bit too, about when we going back to Brueggemann. I know that this is a stretch trying to connect all these different readings that we've done for the semester. But going back to Brueggemann, remember what he talks about the potential for moral imagination comes first through the grief, and then it allows space for us to start reimagining through the fragmentation of the narrative, a new recreation, a weaving together. And that's why it was so beautiful that the end of Holland's poem was about this quilt fabric of these lives, right? That these fragmented stories of disappearances and loss and not sure who's dead and not sure who's still hospital, where this person, that the fragments of these lives became this quilt, became this new, and to me that just reminded me so much of what Brueggemann was talking about when our narrative is erupted and shattered, even our theology, that unsettling deconstructive process of destroying our theology from the inside, from the spiritual experience of somebody that doesn't fit, somebody like Job, that all those fragments can be then somehow re-sewn back together again to create this new theological quilt work that perhaps gets it better. I mean, maybe not right, but gets it better, starts to reimagine an alternative way forward, a new way forward. Yeah.
Can I share
Yes,
an example
please.
of that?
Please.
I think that fits in. Moral imagination comes through the grief. So during the grief crisis, the MCC church in Castro, it was ground zero, and that's where all the funerals were being done. And they would say they wouldn't know from week to week who would be with them again or not, and all the funerals that were going on. It was also during this time that the MCC was trying to get into the National Council of Churches, and they wouldn't recognize them in a delegation. This is a way longer story. I'm going to try to condense it, hopefully due respect to the work. The delegation came to the MCC church to have worship with them at their Sunday night service. Wouldn't partake in communion because it was people of all these different faiths, and they can't do that together.
Yeah.
And I believe it was at that service that I've been trying to remember his name, Randy, the pastor later, would preach that all of them there were the body of Christ, including all of these gay men, and particularly these gay men with AIDS, and preach that the body of Christ has AIDS. And that just shockwaves through to take that metaphor, body of Christ, and reflect it that way through that experience of grief, and then say something theological about that, and also hopefully engender solidarity and a change of heart from the church, which did sort of slowly happen.
Yes. No, that's an incredible example. It reminds me actually, it's been a couple days since I read it, but doesn't Nadar at one point talk about the inability for certain metaphors to work anymore in her article? At some point she says something about certain metaphors that lose their authority or their revelatory ability. Yes, page 354. 354, second paragraph, the sort of bottom of that paragraph, she writes, the reason that theologians, she's talking about the rereading of the way in which God is perceived is indeed significant for our own reading of the book of Job in the HIV/AIDS era. The reason that theologians and others fail to see the impossibility of HIV/AIDS being a punishment from God is because the vision they have of God is that of the great patriarch, one who sits in judgment of his clan when they have erred in their ways. Transforming the way in which we see God is the first step towards transforming the way in which we see God in our suffering. So she's talking about the metaphor of, she argues, and I think she's quite astute in this, she argues that Job actually gets it the same as his friends and Elihu, that she doesn't give Job nearly as much credit as Gutierrez does, which I actually thought was quite helpful, because we see the sort of remnants of this theology of blessings and curses in Job, where he, especially in the text that we're going to look at for today, where he's talking about, I did, in the days of old when this used to happen, and I used to be this person of great honor and wealth, and I did all these great things, and you blessed me, and now look at me, right? He's still living in this theology. And so Nadar argues that both the friends and Job, and even Elihu, have this image of God as the great patriarch because of the patriarchalism of the very culture itself. And that anthropomorphism, that way in which they're reflecting themselves, their own patriarchal system on God, is disabling them, it's blinding them from potentially seeing God not as a patriarch, but as a co-sufferer, as somebody that is seeing God differently, and that the metaphor no longer works. And this is what liberation theology has been so good at doing, where Cone makes Jesus a black messiah, where Gutierrez and Boff make Christ the deliverer and liberator in Exodus, whose salvation is not a spiritual liberation and a saving you from your sins and atoning for you on the cross, but it's a freeing you from slavery. It's an economic freedom. It's a freedom for you to have new jobs, and it's a freedom for... These images shift something in our imagination, and they create new possibilities, both for organization, for theology, for attending, being able to see people that we wouldn't be able to see before. When we start to talk about God as the body of Christ as having AIDS, whoa, all of a sudden we have to see people that have AIDS. And suddenly it transforms the way we do Eucharist, it transforms who we do Eucharist with. The brokenness of a body becomes literally a broken body. It changes the power of the metaphor. And this is the power of sacraments. Sacraments do this for us. But when they lose their sacramental value, when they lose their ability to manifest the divine reality in our midst, we have to do what Nadar is calling us to do and reread. We have to do something different because it stops being revelatory. And so my proposition for today's lecture discussion is going to be that it's all about revelation. That the book of Job is about revelation. What brings revelation? It's not about theodicy. It's about revelation. So, any final comments from those that may not have had a chance to say anything yet about the readings that we've looked at so far? I don't want to rush
I have
us.
one thing I was
Yeah,
wondering
please.
was whether,
Please.
I don't know, because Job is discouraged by his friends' kind of insensitivity, and I think that, I guess it kind of showed, I guess because he had a previous place in society and all this prestige, and I guess it kind of, it's a warning for us, because, I don't know, you could easily do the same thing to someone who hasn't had all that, and they may not be able to
Push back.
yeah, because if
Yes.
he does and he gets through his own theology and
So insightful, though. Yeah, I totally had not thought of that, but you're totally right.
I just thought of it and I thought, well, maybe that could happen. I mean, I know it's only a fable, but it's true.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's the thing with Job. It's like, yeah.
really insightful. I totally agree with you, and that relates directly to our theme for today, which is about how not to talk about God in the midst of suffering. And one of the things that West argues is that it must be the interpretive process of the Bible for it to be transformed, for it to be revelatory, has to happen in these local communities. It can't happen. I mean, there are moments where it happens from the pulpit, where the bishop or the priest or the pastor or whomever says something, and all of a sudden it shifts something in us where, you know, you are the body of Christ. The body of Christ has AIDS. The body of Christ is these men with AIDS. There can be those moments, surely prophetic moments, and I think that's what the prophetic language of Gutierrez is intending, to talk about the way in which that prophetic moment can break in. But what spiritual practice-wise, what West helps us see is that creating space for these voices that might not have the ability to talk back is key to letting them talk back. Because he even says that in the African tradition, lament isn't commonly practiced. And so there would be no normal space within the religious life of a community for lament to be articulated. That's what he says.
That's what really surprised me, because I didn't know whether he was still always talking about that
Community. Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
I was like, really?
Yeah. And I don't know a lot about Gerald West. I don't know if you looked at the bibliography at all, but he's incredibly well published. So I don't know a ton about him. But I do know that he is on the, clearly very well versed. Just by glancing at his bibliography a couple of days ago, I was like, wow, he is very well versed in African theology. So it's clear that is his context. But yeah, you're right. I mean, his whole strategies for rereading the Bible is about creating space for voices of those who might not otherwise have the authority or ability to talk back, and allowing them the resources that they need to create their own vocabulary, which I thought was really interesting. Validation of their process is key to healing their trauma. Okay, let's turn to the outline that I created for us for today. I did that instead of a PowerPoint so that we could have Steve with us on the computer. Okay, so let's start by taking a little bit more of a close look at the structure. We read a structural overview all the way back when we read the article or the chapters from why Job doesn't help us answer the puzzling questions of suffering. We looked at the structure of Job, but I want us to break back in at right after 28, which is where we left off last time when we were talking about the hymn, right? Which many scholars have said is kind of the center of the book and is kind of a shift. After the hymn on wisdom in chapter 28, we no longer hear from the friends who took up so much space in the first half of the book, making their arguments. Instead, we hear from Job for 3 straight chapters, and then we're introduced, or 4 straight chapters, and then we're introduced to Elihu. who kind of arises out of nothingness. We don't even know that he's on the scene, and all of a sudden he breaks in. Okay, so Job 28 is the hymn on wisdom, where there's this celebration of the untraceable path of God's mystery and God's wisdom, that it's hidden, that it's worth more than any other thing, that is, more than any precious, gems, more than any precious ore, that it's, none of the great personified forces of earth, like death and the deep and the sea, none of them know where to find this one. It's only the fear of the Lord that knows how to get there. And then Job breaks in after just talking about the fear of the Lord and starts sassing the Lord again, which is just funny that there's this permission that's given in the spirituality of Job to, in one moment, sort of honor and revere and worship the sort of fearfulness of the mystery and power of God, and then in the next instance to kind of mouth off, right? So 29, he takes up the theme again and starts talking about he kind of gives a summary of his whole cause, a summary of everything he said to this point. And he does that by starting with a nostalgia of his past. Oh, as I was in my flourishing days when God sheltered my tent, when the Almighty was still with me, when my children were around me, when my footsteps were bathed in cream, and the rocks flowed with streams of oil. Again, he's using very flowery language to talk about this moment where he was a person of honor, where he was surrounded by wealth, where he was obedient to God and God was close to him, and there were material blessings that were associated with it. I wore my righteousness like a garment. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor. Right? So he's recasting himself again in complete opposition to the friends who have said, just admit that you didn't do these things, confess, and God will have mercy. He's recasting himself again in a narrative that is undergirded by a temporal theology of retributive justice, or of blessings and curses. Then in 30, he shifts his language again, and it kind of changes from the past to the present. And he begins the poetry that Justine read for us today, where younger ones than I, people who I would have held in disdain before, right, the shameful, the people that in society don't have honor, are now mocking me. Look how far I've fallen, is essentially what he's saying. They were banished from the community. They were outcasts, right? They were the ones who kind of mulled around in the bushes and were in the valleys, and now they're the ones who are laughing and deriding me. I've become a byword among them. They abhor me. They stand aloof. And then he turns to God specifically, and his language in the same way, structure of lament that we saw in Lamentations 1 and 2, the plurality of his enemies, right? First he's talking about these enemies, these ones who deride him, these people that are mocking him. And all of a sudden he turns to personal language in verse, if you look, you have 30 in front of you, verse 17. At night he pierces my bones. My sinews have no rest. Sorry, this is a different translation. With great difficulty I change my clothes, and the collar of my tunic fits around my waist. He has cast me into the mire. I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand, but you take no notice. You have turned into my tormentor, and with your strong hand you attack me. You raise me up and drive me out before the wind. I'm tossed around by the storm. Indeed, I know that you will return me to death, to the house that is destined for everyone who is alive. I prefer this translation actually much more than the NRSV. But this is Kathleen O'Connor's translation. Yeah, I find it much more compelling, and I actually think that the Hebrew is better as well. I can copy this and make this available for you if you'd like to.
It's always good to compare. Dr. Nassim would say they're all universally bad anyway, but there were times when actually, look at the Acts of the Apostles, actually the Jerusalem Bible was a better reading of it than the RSV. The RSV had the broadest base committee, but it doesn't mean it's perfect. It's just good to compare them and just see which. And
sometimes reading it in somebody else's different, like sort of linguistic, especially in poetry, it can just carry more
Yeah,
poignancy.
yeah,
It can strike you better. Yeah.
Why do they always mention like ostriches and jackals? Yeah, anything like, is it like kind of wilderness animals? Like, what is it?
Yeah.
It's like,
O'Connor talks about it in her. She talks about.
it seems a bit random.
Isn't it funny?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a specific trope.
Okay.
Job's friends are like ostriches. They bury their heads in the sands of the denial of Job's innocence. And ostriches are also an example of God's wild and free creatures, which Job takes as a symbol of himself, is what she says. But jackals, of course, are ones that share the sort of common experience of being hated, right? Because they're the ones that kind of scavenge. They're like they're the ones you kind of want to stay away from. They come in and they eat dead bodies and they eat carcasses and they're right. And he's saying, these are my friends, the ones who hide their heads in the sand, run around in the middle of a desert with no, and the people that everybody else hates, the scavengers. And so it could possibly even be tongue-in-cheek that the only friends that Job has left, are the ones who, A, are scavengers, other people that are suffering and dishonored, and B, the friends who are his theological friends, his theologians, his great wise people, whose heads are buried in the sand because they don't want to look at his suffering. That's what he has as companionship. Which is a sad story. Okay, so his lament moves from him observing his surroundings, saying, look how far I've fallen, all of these people are now turning against me, even the people that I would have extended mercy to who were outcasts in society, now they're making fun of me. And then he turns back to his sort of, what I call in the outline, his divorce proceedings, where he's taking God to court. And he's saying, look what you've done to me. You're tormenting me. You're going to carry me all the way to death. You've taken me up in the storm, which of course is an image that reverts him back to his first wager, God's first wager, right? Where the cyclone comes in, the storm comes in and literally picks up his children and kills them. And he's saying, you've picked me up in your storm, Yahweh, Elohim, and you're throwing me around in the tempest and you're going to cast me down into death. He's putting God on trial and he's saying, you who is my husband, you who I am covenanted to, these are judicial divorce proceedings. I mean, this is like judicial language of divorce. I mean, he's claiming that God is his divine abuser, his partner and his abusive partner. Okay, and so then in 31, where Job's voice continues to rail, he brings up 16 oaths, 16 different things that he commits himself to. And the formula, linguistically, is if I had or have done this, if I have done X, there are 16 oaths, which he says are his claims to his innocence, right? And again, this is specifically him speaking back to his friends. If I have or had done X, then let Y happen to me. He is, even though he's speaking back to his friends, and saying, I'm innocent, and he's making 16 claims, he moves from communal life and honesty, right? That's the first thing he says, is in community I was like this. I was honest, I never lied. Then he moves to social justice, this is how I treated the poor. Then he moves to creation care, this is how I treated the land. Then he moves to idolatry, which all of these things are idolatry, right? Because if you set them above how you're supposed to be in relationship with God, you're loving the thing more than you're loving God himself. So idolatry, and then he concludes his oaths by begging for a mediator or an arbiter in his court case against God to testify that, in fact, he was faithful. So why should not have happened to him? If I treated the earth in a certain way, then let this punishment happen to me. If I had done this to the poor, then let this suffering befall me. But I didn't. So interestingly enough, and this is what compels me to relate with Nadar, is he is speaking back against his friends, saying he's still innocent, but he's still using the same kind of temporal paradigm of blessings and curses to make his case to God. That's what makes it so problematic. He doesn't offer a new theological paradigm. He stays in the same one. So then Elihu breaks in. Who is Elihu? Well, I'm suggesting that Elihu is the one that finalizes our theology that traumatizes despite his good intentions. A couple of background pieces on his character. Because of the fact that it falls after the hymn and sort of switches gears, it's possible that these laments could have been the end of the original edition, and they were followed by the breaking in of the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, who comes in and says, gird up your loins, this is what I want to hear to you. So it's possible that Elihu, in the entirety of his 4 very long-winded speeches, is a late addition, because he's never mentioned. It's also possible that there was pre-existing material in the oral tradition of how the friends talked that was excluded, that got compiled together and became Elihu. Or it's possible that Elihu existed from the very beginning, and because of his youth, he was not noted as being present, but that the second half of the book exists to say even the young ones who come in with a prophetic voice still don't have the wisdom to do what God's self can do when God shows up. So we've exhausted all of the wise words and wise proverbs and the juristic thoughts and the wisdom sayings of all of these elders, and even now the young prophetic voice is also exhausted. What's interesting about him is that, like Steve said, he does anticipate some of what God is going to say. His articulation about creation, the theme of creation in his speeches, in some ways almost makes it like, why didn't we just cut right to what Yahweh had to say? Why did Elihu even have to speak? Because he repeats some of what the friend says, and then he repeats some of what Yahweh's about to say, and in the end, he really doesn't say anything except, Job, listen to me. Job, listen to me. You have nothing to say. Listen to me. Listen to me. I'm young, but I'm speaking for God, right? So it's possible that the reason that he's edited into 4 different speeches could be 2 things. That was the way that the edited material was compiled, that there were these 4 fragments that got composed as 4 different speeches. Or it's possible that the original editor was trying to create a character. And he was creating the flaws of Elihu by saying, look how he starts so arrogantly. Look how he claims to speak for God. Then in the next one, he starts making fun of the friends, and he's making fun of his elders. Then in the next one, he's saying, oh, look at the mystery of God. And he's developing these character flaws by making him so long-winded. It's possible that those are 2 editorial stylistic possibilities. Okay, so what about Elihu specifically? Well, Elihu claims that he's speaking for God. Where the friends are saying, let's try this on for size, he comes in with a much stronger claim and says, I have been given a word from the Spirit. I know I'm young, but I've been given a word from the Spirit. And so that emboldens him, despite his youth, to command Job to speak, to listen. To side you, and he says, what does he say? He says, you are being unjust to God. In other words, he's saying, your laments fall outside of the appropriate way to be in relationship with Elohim. He's shaming him. Job's only recourse, remember when we went the slides when we were talking about the 3 different identities, the theologian, the jurist, and the philosopher, in each of them they're building their cases, and Job reverts to not speaking about God, but speaking to God in the form of lament. That is his mode. That is the way that he's dealing with his suffering. And then when Elihu shows up, Elihu says, I've heard from the Lord. You, in your lament, are violating your relationship with God. He's trying to shame him. And then he says, it's clear that he's been listening, which is one of the things that Steve said about the propheticism of him is that he's listened to the friends and he's making commentary on their speeches. He's listened to God, because remember he's talking about contemplate the nature, contemplate God's mystery, and don't try to control God. It's clear that he's listening both to God, revelation and creation, to the friends, to the critique of the friends, and to Job's lament, because he critiques Job's lament. So he's listening. He's just being pretty arrogant in the way in which he's responding. So he says, you are definitely unjust, and you're right. You do need a mediator. You do need an arbiter. And some scholars think that by him saying that, again, talking about characterization, just who is this character. It's not that he's being empathetic, that he's saying, oh, I'm hearing your cry, you do need a mediator, you need a third party to stand in there and witness for you. It's that he's claiming that he's that person. Me, the young guy, the guy that knows, I'm the one that sees how it's really going on. These friends, these old men, their philosophies can't fully understand. God is mystery. Don't try to tell God how to act. God is the creator. Don't try to lament to God and are you more just than God is? You do need a mediator. And in parentheses, I am that one who's going to mediate to God for you and ask for your forgiveness. That God would be just, merciful because you've spoken out of turn. He's saying Job's words deserve divine punishment. His lament deserves God's wrath. And he questions Job's wisdom and the friend's wisdom. And his solution? Submit to God. Submit to the transcendent. God is God. God does in creation what God wants to do. God does in justice what God wants to do. You are not God. How dare you pretend to be God and ask God why God's being the way God is being? And he even goes so far as to say, God does not hear your cries or the cries of the oppressed. God is God. And this is the moment where I think there's a really strong possibility that despite the beginning of the propheticism that both Steve and Gutierrez suggested, that he starts to develop that prophetic language that becomes that alternative way of speaking in the midst of suffering. He doesn't do a good enough job. Partially A, because he misses the contemplative piece. He does not speak to God, he speaks about God. But then secondarily, he doesn't understand that lament is the way that the oppressed cry out to God. And that standing with them in that and actually joining with them in solidarity is an appropriate way to relate to God. He makes it unpermissive, Elihu. So he further traumatizes Job in the midst of Job's trauma by saying, not just making a theological comment, but actually saying your spirituality is also faulty. Not just your theology, but your claim that this is how you ought to be in relationship with the divine, that you can carry this suffering unto God. God is God. How dare you? Submit to God, and God will forgive you. And he concludes by, strangely enough, reverting to the same old. God rewards good and punishes evil. Therefore, contemplate creation and be in awe. That's how Elihu ends. And then, so that's chapter 37, where Elihu is, of course, creating beautiful poetry about creation. And this is the thing that's so fascinating. He's anticipating much of what will come when the Lord shows up and speaks. But what I'm arguing is that what's different, and this is your second point after enter Elihu, is that what's different, and this goes back to the first week when we didn't get to the two bookends. We talked about the bookends at the very beginning. My question for you is whether at the end of 2 weeks of studying the book of Job, whether or not you side with the scholars that say that when God shows up, God's inappropriate in his way in which he addresses. A lot of scholars feel uncomfortable with the voice of Yahweh when Yahweh breaks in because he doesn't seem to really be answering Job's question. And they're asking, is he even listening? I mean, is Yahweh even listening to what Job is asking him? But what I'm arguing is two things. It's first, that when God shows up, he shows up in two important literary ways. And of course, this is because this is my critical consciousness. I employ literary criticism. It's what I do as a scholar. So these are two literary critical ways that I think are important for understanding the stylistic logic behind why Yahweh shows up in the way that he shows up. First, he shows up as the tetragrammaton. Right, which is Yahweh. He doesn't show up as El, Elohim, Eloha, all of the names of God, the provider, the sovereign one, the almighty, that all of the friends and Elihu, for 40-something chapters almost, have been calling him. It's all of these other names. They're not wrong. That's not what I'm saying. All of the other names that the friends and that Elihu employ, however, create an identity for God. The God of retribution, the God of justice, the God that is sovereign, this God out there, right? Who does not have a personal name, El, the Almighty One, right? Essentially all of this is the Almighty One. That's the name that the friends are using for nearly 40 chapters. And then suddenly Yahweh shows up. And Yahweh hasn't been there in this literary nomenclature since the heaven scene. That's the last time we heard about Yahweh, was when Yahweh was sitting in heaven. And who is Yahweh? Well, Yahweh, like I've mentioned before, is the I am, who I am. And I am the one who has been with this person, this person, this person. He's the God that has relationship with, Jacob and, all of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So it is the one who is in relationship. It's the covenanted one who shows up. It's not the Almighty One. It's not the I am God and this is who I am and so submit to me. That's how he could have shown up, and that's almost how he performs, right? He performs saying, look at all these things that I've done, look at my power. But the point is not his power when he shows up, because he shows up as the personal one. He shows up as the one who's in relationship. And he's entering back into, and this is my second point, and this is what for me, linguistically, or like literarily, is compelling about why I don't think that it's beside the point that God shows up in the way God shows up. Because when Job, and this goes back to Nadar's reading, when Job finds his voice in chapter 3, Nadar argues that the wife is the key hermeneutic. And because we don't look at women in the texts, we've never looked at her. We always deride her and think, oh, she's telling him to curse God? How horrible is she?
Or was she telling him to bless God?
Or was she telling him to bless God?
Yeah, the word actually wasn't clear.
Right.
That they read one or the other.
But she's typically derided in exegetical readings of this text. And she's always forgotten. And Nadar's point is that if we read Job's wife as the hermeneutical key, when Job finds his voice, he finds his voice as one who curses. What does he curse? The day of his birth, the day of his conception, that he survived nursing and suckling at the breast of his nursemaid, that he survived youth, that he was remembered, that God saw him and now God hates him. And more than that, just that God saw him and pointed out to the Satan, go strike this one down and see what happens. I mean, he hates his life, right? He hates his life. And so this takes us to what West is saying, where when we're given permission to be able to say out loud, I hate my life, this is horrible, it gives us honest engagement with God and with our community. We stop living in this narrative of Elihu. Employ this type of theology, employ this type of spirituality, because submit to God. Submit to God. That's the way that you be faithful. That's the way that you be honest. That's the way that you be Christian, right? Or whatever. Jewish in this case, God-fearing. The point is that when Job enters into conversation personally with God, he curses creation. His own creation, his conception. So, when the Tetragrammaton, the personal God, Yahweh, the one who covenants God's self to us, the one who speaks to us, who shows up in the burning bush, who shows up in the fire, who shows up in the God who shows up and tents among us, dwells among us, not the Elohim, not the abstract God who's powerful and almighty and other and transcendent and submit to him. The God who shows up and enters into Job's conversation. How? not by cursing creation, but by blessing it. Were you there when I did this? Look at all I've done. It's wild and it's free and it's crazy. So, all of that to say, oh man, we have so much more we could do with this. And maybe we will. I'm just thinking I really want to get to a chance to talk about Spivak. And okay, so we'll stop here and then we'll pick up here. We're not meeting Monday. Okay, we'll pick up here when we get back from Thanksgiving. And we have some extra time because we have after people's presentations to still talk. Because I want to talk about the spirituality that's being constructed in Job as well. But we'll stop here for now.
Thank you.
Good? Okay. Bye. Hope you're having a good time. I mean, I know you're not having a good time, but I hope it's